It never occurs to these folks that when you go up and dig up an indigenous grave site, a native site, perhaps they don't want you to take their things. These things were buried in the ground for a reason, right? These grave goods were buried spiritually for their loved ones to take with them into the spirit world. So it's not okay that you come and take them out of the ground and take them home. I don't care that you're trying to preserve them. That's not what they were intended. And that's that morality piece that seems to be missing a lot in the mindset of Don and like-minded folks. That it's not up to you to come along and dig these things up and just take them home.
Welcome to episode 374 of FBI Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent and former FBI art crime team leader, Tim Carpenter, who served in the FBI for 20 years. In this episode, Tim reviews his case where 5,000 illegally collected cultural artifacts and 2,000 human burial remains were seized by the FBI from the Indiana home of grave robber Don Miller. Many of the pieces in Miller's illicit collection of over 42,000 items were looted from sacred burial and cultural heritage sites around the world. Tim Carpenter is the author of The Grave Robber, a part true crime narrative, part procedural that recounts a behind-the-scenes look at the meticulous work involved in the FBI's investigation of Don Miller, detailing the complex challenges of recovering stolen cultural artifacts and the legal and moral dilemmas of repatriating them to their rightful communities. During Tim Carpenter's bureau career, he specialized in counterterrorism, major theft, and art crime investigations. He led one of the FBI's most sensitive counterterrorism operations, earning the FBI Director's Award. Tim joined the art crime team and participated in numerous high-profile art theft cases. He later became the head of the program, expanding the team by 300%, modernizing investigative approaches, developing a new national stolen art database, and strengthening partnerships with museums, art houses, cultural institutions, and law enforcement agencies around the world. Following his retirement, Tim founded Argus Cultural Property Consultants, a global firm specializing in cultural property protection, risk management, and investigative services. As the managing director, he has staffed the consulting firm with a world-class team of former FBI agents, prosecutors, museum security directors, and cultural heritage experts. A sought-after speaker, Tim lectures internationally on art crime, cultural heritage, illicit trafficking, and museum security. As I mentioned last week, I'm off to Thailand for 2 weeks, so there won't be an episode next week, and I will replay a very special episode the first week of November. This also means that my November email to Reader Team members will be delayed. Look for it on November 10th, and I'll include a few photos from my adventures in Thailand. Now, before we get to the case review, I've been invited to speak about the FBI in books, TV, and movies at the Wilmington University True Crime Series. If you're going to be in the Philadelphia, Delaware area on November 11th, that's Veterans Day, I hope to see you there. The event is free. The link to register is on the homepage of my website, jerrywilliams.com. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes. You'll also find links to where you can buy me a cup of coffee, join my reader team about crime fiction and the FBI in books, TV, and movies, and learn more about me and my books. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Tim Carpenter. Hi, Tim.
Hey, Jerry.
I'm excited to have you here because I just finished reading your book, The Grave Robber. And it was an enlightening look at the importance of the art crime team. And so I can't wait to get into that case, but I hope also at the end to touch on the art crime team and how the program has revolved. I know about the art crime team because I was in Philadelphia, good friends with the original team leader, Bob Whitman.
With Bob, yeah.
So I would call what we're going to talk about today, especially at the end when we talk more about the art crime team itself, but I would say this is art crime team 2.0.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, not the original team, but we definitely were born from there. Some might say, right, Philadelphia was the birthplace of the art crime team.
At the time that it started was right about the time I stopped doing investigations and became the Philadelphia media rep. And so a lot of the things that Bob was doing with the media and out in the public, kind of talking about the team, I was fortunate enough to work with him and Bonnie down at headquarters at the beginnings of the art crime team. I also did an episode 341, with Jeff Kelly, who was also on the art crime team with you, and that was about a theft and recovery. Where do you want to start?
Where to start? It's always the difficult question. This book, The Grave Robber, is about the FBI's investigation into Don Miller, who was a collector, an antiquities and artifacts collector in rural Indiana. And to say that it's an unusual case is an understatement, right? I think you have personal experience with the art crime team, working with Bob for years, and you kind of saw the genesis of that program as we expanded over time. And most people intuitively, when they think of the art crime team, what comes to mind, is these are the guys and gals that are out chasing around stolen Van Goghs and stolen Da Vinci paintings. And that's certainly true. We do that work. I don't think most people realize how esoteric the program is and how broad the reach of the program, whether we're chasing stolen artworks, fraudulent artworks, fakes and forgeries, if we're doing antiquities trafficking, money laundering, sanctions evasion cases, all of these things. Most people don't really realize how broad the program actually is. And the Miller case is a good example of the reach of that program, and we kind of sometimes stray into unusual and different territory. So that in itself made the Miller case unusual, but what really made the case so unusual was even within our own program, the scope of it was just massive, and we had never really experienced collection of this magnitude, this size, with as many problems as this one had. So I'll start by saying all of that. And to get into the story, right, of the grave robber, it all started, and they say that it all started one cold, windy evening. I was at home, I juggled lots of duties like most agents. At the time, I was assigned to the Indianapolis field office, having not really recently, but recently having transferred there from Miami. So I was an art crime agent. I did that work, but my real job, my day job for the FBI was as a special agent bomb technician. And so not surprisingly, when I transferred to Indianapolis, they had assigned me to work on the domestic terrorism squad. And so I was busy with my day job doing, DT cases and mainly focused on doing bomb tech duties, which were pretty much full time, but doing the best I could to keep my hands into the art crime world, because that is really where my passion lies, and really enjoy that work. And you might imagine things were sort of slow in Indiana on that front. And then one evening, I got a phone call from my DT supervisor, Leslie, who said, "Hey, we just had a lead come in and it's related to Native American artifacts and human remains." She looked at it and kind of her first inclination was to kick it over to your Fish and Wildlife or BIA. I can't really remember now where she wanted to send it, but it is a cultural property crime matter. Of course, I was kind of hurting for art crime work. So I was like, no, don't send that lead over just yet. Kick it over to my desk and let me look at it and let's see what's there. And that's how that started, right? I think that was the fall of 2013. And Jerry, well yourself, most good cases come from just tugging on a thread, right? You never know what's going to unspool in front of you. And that's what happened here. We started tugging on that thread and, try to corroborate some of the information that the tipsters brought in initially. And, all of a sudden we realized we've got this case. And then as we dove into it, we realized we have this really massive case in all places but rural Indiana. I mean, this is farm country, right? This guy's property was in the middle of corn pastures.
Now, before you continue, I think we got to go back just a few steps, because when I think of an agent that might be interested in art crime, I don't necessarily associate them with somebody who's also interested in bomb disposal, a bomb tech.
Yeah, I thought you might want to go back and talk about that. I get that quite a bit. My background before the FBI is I went in the military. I was that generation of kid that grew up watching Top Gun like everybody else, at that age in the 80s. And like most young boys, I wanted to just go fly fighter jets and be Tom Cruise. Desert Storm started, and there was my chance to do that. Of course, they laughed at me because I was, 18 years old. Nobody's going to hand me an F-14 at 18. But when you're young, you don't realize that. So they gave me a choice at the time, and I chose explosive ordnance disposal. That was my job in the military. And so for your listeners, anybody that's seen the movie Hurt Locker is kind of the Hollywood version of that job. But that's what I did. So I did bomb disposal for the military. And, I did that for a while. And then as I was transitioning out of the military, I went back to college and got my degree. And I was thinking about, where do I go next? So my only real skill set at the time was being a bomb technician. Well, if you're a young guy and you're a bomb technician, the only place you have really to go with that skill set is, either into federal law enforcement or, in my case at the time, into state or local law enforcement, right? Well, I guess I'll go be a cop and be on the bomb squad. And truthfully, I didn't really at the time have this burning desire to be a cop. It just was the natural progression for me to do it. And so that's what I did. Went off and did that.
I understand where you happened to fall into the bomb tech job, but when did you start your interest in art crime and art?
That's an important question. It's kind of a part of this overall story. So I enlisted in the service. My dream had been to be an artist. And so my best friend and I at the time through high school, we were both aspiring artists. We spent a lot of time training and studying art. He went on to the Memphis College of Art. I had intended to do the same, go to the Memphis College of Art, which that school is not there anymore, but it was a fairly well-known art school in my area of the world. But Desert Storm started, and so instead I enlisted. I gave up my dream to be an artist to go off and do the military thing. And so I kind of set my paintbrushes down and my pens down and went off to do this other life. And so we come back full circle, after I have this career of being a cop. And then I end up in the FBI. And I think I was like most people when I joined the FBI. I had no idea that they even worked art crime cases. If you think about it, the art crime team didn't form until late 2004. Technically, it was like the first few days of January in 2005, but we often cite it as, December of 04. And so the program was brand new. It was an infant when I came into the Bureau. I came in early 2004. And so, but like most, wasn't really aware that they did it. And I just happened to kind of find myself in the right place at the right time. I was in Miami and I ended up on the Major Theft Squad, which, as you know, that was the squad responsible for working art crime cases. And the moment I heard that they had that, kind of went to the supervisor at the time and really didn't give him a choice. And I was like, Dave, I'm taking all of those cases. And of course, they chuckled at me and, they were happy to let me have them. But that's how I ended up working art crime cases. I just kind of happened to stumble into it.
And how did you get on the team? Because there's a difference between working one of those cases on a squad and actually being a part of this rapid deployment team.
That's absolutely right. That's a good question. So, again, in those early formative years of the team, it was pretty young and was small. I think when I came on the team, there were only, 8 of us at the time spread around nationally. And so really it was at the time was just kind of a collection of agents loosely working art crime cases in the field that would get together once a year at a conference and talk about their cases. It wasn't really a team in so much as it was just in title. So there I was in Miami, but we didn't have an art crime team agent on the official team at the time in Miami. So you mentioned Bonnie. Bonnie Magnus Gardner was kind of spearheading the program at headquarters at the time. And so I had a conversation with her. They wanted to fill that position in Miami. There I sat. I was like, well, that's going to be me. Didn't really want to take no for an answer on that. And she was gracious enough to let me in, to accept me onto the team.
Being in the right place in the right time always works out.
Isn't that right? Isn't that the only way? It really truly is the only way. And over the years, I've had a lot of prospective agents or young agents come to me about how do I get onto the art crime team? There's a lot of interest in the program. And unfortunately, the answer usually is just that. Well, it's a lot of luck. You have to be in that right place at the right time. There has to be a need for an agent in that specific office. You have to have the skill set and the passion and the background, and it just all lined up for me. And the rest is history, as they say.
Very good. All right. Now that we have an idea how you got there, let's learn some more about this case.
Sure.
Oh, wait a minute. You're in Miami. Now you're in Indiana.
Yeah.
Just real briefly, talk about that.
Yeah, so I started my FBI career in the Louisville field office. And interestingly, again, I really didn't know that the FBI was working art crime cases. In 2004, we were all pretty much working counterterrorism. But I happened to stumble on an op one day. They did an all hands request, and I went out on a search warrant operation that Bob Whitman was a part of. He had served as undercover on that case. Now, I didn't know Bob Whitman from Adam at the time, but I went out on this operation, recovered some stolen Civil War paraphernalia, memorabilia stuff, maps and letters and those kinds of things. And that was my first realization that the Bureau worked this type of crime. And it, of course, immediately was laser focused on it. Like, this is what I want to do. But if you recall, back in those days, they had a little program in place called the Mandatory Transfer Program. I think that was what they called it. But, we were mandatory transfers at the time. So I transferred to Miami from Louisville. I worked some counterterrorism stuff in Miami, quickly grew tired of it, and asked them very nicely to let me go back to work in criminal programs. And they did. So that's what I explained already. I landed on the major theft squad and then just started working art crime. So I worked art crime cases in Miami for years and was quite busy there, right? As you can imagine, it's one of the hub, locations in the country for the arts. And so I was very busy with cases there. But then I got my office of preference transfer to Indianapolis. And I remember thinking like, oh God, there goes my art crime career. Like, what kind of work am I going to get in Indianapolis? But, we put our heads down, my wife and my kids and I, we put our heads down and we transferred to Indy. And I was pleasantly surprised, right? Indianapolis was quite vibrant culturally and had some really wonderful world-class institutions there. And it wasn't doom and gloom like I thought. There was actually some work there for me to do on the art crime side, just enough to keep me busy and kind of keep me flying on the radar a little bit, if you will. And then this case landed in my lap in late 2013 and kind of really just truly fell out of the sky. And no one knew what it was going to be when the tip came in.
All right, let's talk about the tip.
Yeah. So that tip came in again in late October of 2013. And as you know, and many of your listeners will know, there's a number of ways the FBI can receive tips, right? You might get a phone call to the field office. Somebody might walk into the field office. More often than not, these days, those tips go through the Internet Complaint Center, right? And they go to West Virginia through the call center. And that's what happened in this case. In this case, this tip gets routed through IC3 in West Virginia, and it comes down to the field office and finds its way to my supervisor. As you know, these tips will come down through, the supervisors get them and then assign them out. Well, because I was the quote unquote art crime agent for the field office, even though I was on a DT squad, she called me at home and said, hey, are you interested in this? This is what came on the desk. I was going to just ship it along to another agency, but I thought I'd call. And I was like, well, of course I'm interested. Let's take a look. I mean, it was an interesting allegation, right? The tip was Don Miller is this collector, an elderly gentleman that lives in rural Indiana. He's got this massive collection of Native American and other cultural artifacts in his house, many of which are stolen. And he also has a fair amount of stolen and illegally excavated human remains. That was the gist of the tip that came in. Now, I don't know that that was altogether uncommon. We'd worked pot hunter cases. We had done plenty of artifact recovery cases. You get these kinds of tips. It's not often that they come in with allegation of human remains. So I think that for me, that's what got my attention. And of course, without getting too deep into the tipsters and how that came about. But the first thing I did, as you would do, any agent would do, is say, I need some corroboration. Do you have any evidence? Like, what do you have? And they're like, yeah, we have photos. Well, fantastic. Can you send those over to me? So yeah, that's great, right? I mean, we're just at the tip phase, right? I'm just at this assessment phase. And so they emailed me some photos, and the photos were of human remains sitting on some shelves, allegedly in Don's house. And so, yeah, I'm definitely interested at this point. So we'll go back to the office and say, yeah, I think this warrants, some investigation. And we're going to open up an assessment on this and take a look at it. What was fascinating, if you've seen it in the book, what really made this case so easy for me at the beginning, it was really unusual because it was quite simple to just start the case, because what are you going to do as an agent? The first thing you're going to do is sit down at Sentinel, right? You're going to go through FBI databases and you're going to look for any references to your subject that's been alleged in the crime. So I sit down like any other agent and I type in Don Miller's information, collection and immediately get some results back. And what caught my attention was we as the FBI had been to Don's house about 5 years earlier in 2008 on a WMD matter. And reading through that quick file,
I know many of the people who are listening know what WMD is, but you'll have to break down the acronym.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you for acronyms. We love our acronyms. So it was a weapons of mass destruction case. Just a quick file, not a long drawn out investigation, but there were just some information in there about a WMD matter. And so in that case, another tipster had alleged that Don Miller had, quote unquote, a nuclear trigger in his house. Well, it wasn't a nuclear trigger. I skipped it into that story. It ended up being a little bit of depleted uranium that he had gotten lawfully through his time with the Manhattan Project and then subsequently later with the Atomic Energy Commission and DOE. Somewhere along the way, before it had all been regulated, he had gotten a little piece of depleted uranium, but Don loved to tell stories. He was constantly telling stories. And so somewhere along the way, he had told someone, well, this is actually part of a nuclear weapon. That was nonsense, but he told them, well, it concerned them enough to call the FBI. And hence, the FBI and DOE went out there in 2008. So I see this in the file. And what was fantastic was in the 302s from that investigation, these, investigative records that agents write to document their investigation. It's black and white, clear in the report that Don also had this massive collection of Native American artifacts in his house. Well, you can't get better corroboration than that, right? That's the statements of another FBI agent that was out there in 2008 and saw that collection. Now, a lot of people say, well, why didn't the FBI intervene at the time? Well, you have to remember these were weapons of mass destruction agents. They were not art crime agents. They had no training and no experience and no reason to believe that the material they saw in the house was problematic. So they noted it just as an interesting point, like, hey, he's got this pretty cool collection. And that's as far as that went in 2008 until it hit my desk. And so you couple that with the photos of the human remains and it doesn't mean there's anything illegal here yet. It's just enough to warrant us to pay attention. But what was helpful in that regard is the agent, the weapons of mass destruction agent who had documented that file, sat about 4 desks down from me and was still at the field office. So that just really opened the door, made the thing easy. We were able to go. I went and chatted with the agent, and that day I had him pick up the phone and call Don like, hey, let him know we want to come out and do a follow-up on this WMD case 5 years ago, and let him know you're bringing along a buddy who's another agent who just happens to be an art guy who loves art collections and, artifacts. And I told him you had this really cool collection, and do you mind if I bring him along? We come out and look at it. Well, Don was happy to let us come look. And what was so great about that ruse is we were identified. He knew we were FBI agents. We were clear. Told him straight up, we're FBI agents. We want to come out. He just didn't really fully understand what we were looking for. But that gave me immediate, easy access to the collection where he invited us to come in and look. And, we just wanted to see what's in there and see what he would say about it. So we paid Don a visit that afternoon. We spent maybe about an hour out there chatting with him, and he was happy to give me his tour. We certainly didn't see the entire collection, but he gave me, his kind of controlled tour.
You got the 10-cent version as opposed to the dollar version.
That's right. I got the 10-cent version, but, and I didn't have to really solicit a lot of derogatory information from Don. He was happy to just start talking. Don liked to talk, and he would just start telling me stories, and I might point to an object and say, oh, that's really nice. Where did you get that? I mean, that's about as far as I had to nudge, and he just let it go. He started spilling derogatory information that implicated him in federal crimes, that he had illegally obtained some of this. He would talk about going onto reservation land and, using metal detectors, and he would dig these things up on reservation land. He talked about, going to foreign countries and doing excavations and digging up objects and bringing them back. And so we just let him talk, go ahead, tell us your story. And so he was telling us quite a bit. The amazing thing, if you see the book where I wrote in there, like the jaw-dropping moment for me was walking into his house, because the tipster early on, and I'm talking to tipsters about it, I'm trying to decide, well, how big is the collection? They kept using the word huge. Well, it's a huge collection. It's huge. Well, I don't know what that means. Prior to the Miller case, if you had told me somebody had 1,000 of these, that would have been huge. The tipster kept using the word huge. And finally I pinned him down. I was like, look, you got to define it for me. How many pieces are we talking about? And he didn't really know. He's like, well, I'm going to say 200,000 pieces.
Whoa.
Yeah, of course, I chuckled a little bit. I'm kind of smiling. And I was like, yeah, no, you've totally overshot. Nobody has that many. But he kept insisting. He's like, well, I don't know exactly how many, but it's got to be about 200,000.
Maybe we should take a moment to tell people more about Miller, his age, and how long he's been doing this.
Yeah, good point. So at the time, Don was 91 years old, quite elderly, but he was really quite lucid and communicative. He's had a very soft voice. You had to really pay attention to hear him. He had a soft, raspy voice, but still had his wits. He was a highly educated man, had a PhD and a couple of master's degrees, if my memory is correct. Again, I mentioned he had been part of the Manhattan Project. He was on Oppenheimer's team in Los Alamos as they developed the atom bomb out there. And Don liked to tell the story that he was the man who fired the first device at Trinity. I don't think that's true. We tried to corroborate that. We worked with DOE and some of the historical folks out there. We really couldn't ever corroborate that story. Not super relevant to our investigation, so we didn't pursue it. But he liked to tell the story. That's where he got his interest in collecting artifacts and Native American materials was at Los Alamos. It was locked down. It was a black site at the time, and so they didn't have a lot to do. And on the weekends when he wasn't working, he would just wander out in the desert and pick up pottery and arrowheads, those kinds of things. And he had told me several times that he was hooked. And then it became, and I'm quoting him in his words, it became a heroin addiction. He couldn't stop doing it. And so he dedicated his whole life collecting this material. And so he traveled extensively. He would sometimes tell me he had, visited 200 countries, which, of course, there weren't 200 countries, but we took him at his point. He was extraordinarily well traveled. We have all his travel documents. He was extremely well traveled. And he would go into these other countries, oftentimes under the ruse of a missionary. He'd get visas for going in to do missionary work. And then on the weekends, he would go and loot and excavate archaeological sites and burial sites. And so he had been pretty prolific at this for about 60 years by the time we came along when he was 91. I know there was some criticism at the time from people in the public about the FBI. Well, why now, right? Why would the FBI come along and do this now when he's 91? And, the simple answer is, well, we came along the moment we knew about it, right? We realized that there were potential federal crimes involved. It was fascinating that he was known in the community for having the collection and used to give tours, right? People like Girl Scout troops would sometimes come through the house. And so all of that was quite fascinating for me, that the community knew about this, and yet no one in the community questioned the legality or the morality, and the ethics of what he was doing.
Before we get deep into the case, maybe we can just right now talk more about the law and the legality of it all, because there are some people who are thinking, oh, he's collecting, finds that were just out buried in the desert.
Yeah, that's definitely an argument that you hear a lot, particularly from other like-minded folks, but pot hunters, as people might call them, the common vernacular. Listen, Jerry, here's the truth. Your podcast isn't long enough for me to dive deep into the legality of this. We'd need a few hours to do that. Suffice to say that it's a difficult patchwork of federal and state laws that are in play when we look at these types of cases. There are a couple of big hitter federal crimes that a lot of people know about. NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Then you have ARPA, the Archaeological Resource Protection Act. Those are kind of the two big ones that most people will naturally gravitate to, but that's not where it starts or it stops, right? There are plenty of other federal statutes that might be at play. You've got theft from tribal organizations. You've got interstate transportation of stolen property, depredation of government property. There's a whole host of things. You've got the Bald Eagle and Golden Eagle Act. You've got the Endangered Species Act. There's a whole host of federal statutes that might be implicated when we're looking at archaeological materials that are looted, particularly related to Native American sites, right? And you may scratch your head and say, well, why the Endangered Species Act? Well, a lot of times this ethnographic material that sources from an indigenous culture, they might use animal parts from animals that are listed on the ESA, on the Endangered Species Act. Or they may have golden eagle or bald eagle feathers in this ethnographic material, and it might be used for ceremonial purposes. So you can't traffic in those things, right? They're prohibited. And anyway, I don't have time to just really deep dive into all of that, but just to give you some sense, it's a very difficult framework under federal law. And then we have to also look at state and local law and sometimes tribal law. And then much of Miller's collection was international in scope. So we're also deep diving into the international law. What treaties are in place? What bilateral agreements are in place? Was it illegal to export this from the host nation, et cetera, et cetera? And it got to be really difficult, really fast to try to understand this spider web of intricacy that existed with that. But the big question legally for all of this material, the first question I'm always going to ask in an antiquities case like this is when. It's probably the most important question that we have to ask because, as you know, the U.S. Constitution prohibits ex post facto law, right? We don't have retroactive laws. We can't make something illegal retroactively. And so much of what Miller had collected was in the 50s and the 60s. Well, NAGPRA didn't enact until 1990. ARPA didn't enact until 1979. So people that disagree with this would say, well, he collected much of this material prior to the enactment of these laws, and therefore they're not illegal. Well, that may be true for certain federal statutes, but again, we don't start and stop at those. We also have to look at all the other statutes that might be implicated. So it got to be extraordinarily complicated from a legal perspective.
All right, that's from a legal perspective, but you also mention a moral perspective. So why don't we talk about where that comes in?
Again, another fantastic question, a very difficult one to answer. As FBI agents, right, we're not the morality police. We try to look at these things strictly from a textbook federal law framework or a state law framework. But you can't deny there are some moral implications to this type of activity. So most of these collectors will say something along the lines of, well, we're protecting and preserving these things. I went out and dug it up out of a riverbank, and that river was just is eroding, and the banks are collapsing, and this stuff is going to be lost to time, and therefore I'm doing some kind of a public service by covering this material and safeguarding it. Well, maybe, but you're not a museum. You're not open to the public. There's no educational benefit. You didn't do an archaeological dig. We lost all of the archaeological context from your illegal looting, so we're not really learning anything from it, nor is it available to the public. It's not available to scholars. It's not available, most importantly, to the indigenous community that it belonged to in the first place. Like you're taking it from them. So I'm not sure that argument holds a lot of water, not in my personal opinion. There's this really important theme in this, particularly related to human remains, ancestral remains, that these are basic human rights issues. If you bury one of your loved ones, let's say your parent or your grandparent, you bury them as a human being with the understanding that somebody's not going to come along in 20 years, 50 years, or even 200 years, dig them up, dust them off, and go place their skull on their mantle, right? That's just offensive as a human rights issue. And so for me, the Miller case really represented that this was a deep dive into a human rights issue more than it was just an art crime case.
Miller wasn't going to a riverbank, or he wasn't going inside a cave to find these treasures. He was digging up, as your title of your book indicates, graves. He was a grave robber.
Well, let's be clear. He did go to riverbanks. He oftentimes sifted riverbanks, and there's a technique they'll use to do that. He raided burial caves prolifically. We've got his own photographic evidence. We have evidence we seized from him to document it that showed him raiding burial caves in Papua New Guinea, and we had him on Easter Island pulling skulls out of burial caves on Easter Island. I mean, he took human remains out of crypts in historic cemeteries in New Orleans. Wherever he could get them, he would bring home human remains. He would dig up old unmarked grave sites or village sites, and if he stumbled across human remains, he would plunder them. Now, that's not that unusual for these pot hunters that will go out and dig up these sites, but I think what was unusual about Don is his propensity to bring back the remains themselves. Oftentimes, they'll plunder a grave site just for the grave goods that are with the body, and then they'll leave the body in place and just cover it back up. Well, Don rarely did that. He wanted the grave goods. He wanted that booty, if you will, but he was kind of obsessed, if I can say that. He was a bit obsessed with bringing back actual human remains. And, that was the one thing that really surprised us in this case is, I know I'm kind of all over the map here, but if you remember, I said the tipsters had originally supplied me with a few photos of some human remains, but there were only a few. And so we knew, okay, he's got, 3 or 4 skulls in there, human skulls in the house. We really kind of thought that would be the scope of it, but it wasn't until we executed our seizure operation. And on day one, we're grappling with the massive size of this collection and the scope of it. But what we were unprepared for was as we started opening cabinets and doors and closets and tote bins and boxes, 50-year-old boxes that had been in the barn covered in dirt. Everything we opened, there were human remains. And we were not prepared for that. It really, I don't want to get too far ahead and kind of start jumping all over the place, but it really challenged our operational plan and how we were going to proceed with this thing, because we did not expect the sheer number of human remains. And at the end of the day, when our operation was over, we had seized about 2,000 human bones out of there. And those 2,000 human bones, through osteological examination and doing the best that we can to, kind of piece them back together, if you will, represented about 500 individuals. So just to give you some sense of just how deep this obsession went, with bringing back human remains, which is a little unusual.
Absolutely, because when you think of stolen artifacts and art crime, you think about people taking those pots and those type of historical treasures, but it just is unbelievable that they would want to take skulls and bones of people.
Yeah, and I don't want to make broad sweeping statements. I'll just say generally, most people that engage in antiquities and artifacts, I think it's fair to say many of them are into it for a financial gain, right? A lot of people will trade in material for financial purposes. That was not Don. A lot of people assumed that Don had massed this collection for financial gain. He didn't. Don was a collector. He just wanted the piece. He spent quite a bit of money. He spent a small fortune housing, repairing, buying. He bought some of these pieces. Not every single piece was illegally excavated, or at least not by him. He spent quite a bit of financial resources building this collection. And so for him, it was just an obsession. The guy just really was obsessed with collecting the material and didn't really sell any of it. I won't say he never sold anything. That's not true. But that's not what his motivation was. His motivation was more personal and deeper than that.
All right. Well, let's go back chronologically to this beginning, because now you've gone out with this agent who had spoken to him previously about a different type of matter. You've been introduced to Don Miller. You've had an idea of, okay, yeah, he does have some things here that are questionable. What is the next thing you do to further this case along?
You've known a lot of art crime agents in your career, I suspect. We're more generalists than we are specialists, is what I usually like to say. I lecture a lot and I give a lot of public presentations about our program and the work that we do over the years. And normally I lead most of those presentations with something to the effect of, let me dispel any notion that I'm an art expert. I'm not an art expert. I'm an art crime expert. And in fact, if you look at a collection like Don's that spans dozens and dozens of cultures, right, across dozens of epochs. I mean, we had material that was 5,000 years old. We had material that was 200 years old, right? And so if you look at the width and breadth of one of these collections, there is no one person in the world that is an expert on all of those cultures, right? You have to develop this expertise. And so that was my first problem. So I walked into his house that first day, came down the stairs, and his little museum room unfolded against, in front of me. And I know I wrote it in the book and I talk about this a lot, but it was just kind of an moment. Like, you got to be kidding me. I didn't really believe it, right? I'd heard this tipster telling me how large the collection was, but in my mind, I just couldn't see it. I was like, nobody's got that many. And then I walked into his basement and it was like, oh my God, he might actually have 200,000 pieces. It was just stupefying, the size and the scope of this thing. So immediately my mind is like, what have I just done? Right? This is that proverbial bell that you can't unring. You don't get to unsee it. Like, oh, I don't want to do this. I'm going to turn around and leave. Well, as FBI agents, you don't have that luxury. And particularly once he starts to implicate himself, right, in some of these crimes, he's telling us some of these stories about how he illegally obtained some of these objects. It became really challenging for me. And so my mind is immediately going to, I don't even know where to go next. Like, how do we do, like, we've never done anything this big. No one on the art crime team's never done it. Really, the FBI, other than, some massive recovery operation like 9/11, doesn't often do cases like this. And so it was all about, I'm going to need a team. Like, I have to find all the right people. I need to bring in experts. And so that was really the next step. I walk away from this thing that day and immediately have to go into planning mode and team building mode, trying to find all of the right expertise to come in and guide me, because I certainly am not an expert on everything in that room. I have enough knowledge to go, yep, these are problematic. Yep, those are problematic. This doesn't look good. But it's just so massive. There are so many objects on display. And I'll share with you and the listener that on that first visit, can kind of imagine in your head, I'm looking around and I'm kind of like doing Kentucky windage in my head, if you will. I can't go with a notepad and start numbering things and counting them 1, 2, 3. We're in a conversation with him and it's supposed to be natural and we're just trying to get him to talk. But I'm paying attention and I'm looking and I'm just kind of counting cohorts, if you will. And we left that day, and my estimation at the time was he had 20,000 objects on display, which led me to believe he's probably got that many that we can't see. So we left that day thinking, well, he's probably got 40,000 some odd artifacts. My God, what do you do with that, right? Like, what if I have to seize all of those? Now, we don't know that that's the case, but you start from worst case and plan backwards. And I'm like, okay, if I've got to seize 40,000 artifacts, I mean, you were an agent, Jerry, for a long time. How do you seize 40,000 of anything?
It is amazing to even think about it. Overwhelming.
If I told you to go seize 40,000 guns or 40,000 stolen computers, that's overwhelming. And now we're talking about not guns or computers. We're talking about historical objects that are extraordinarily unstable in the environment. Some of these things, if you touch them, they might crumble. And you don't want to be the person that's responsible for that, right? That destroys, a 5,000-year-old pottery example. So all of these things, as you can imagine, are starting just kind of like billiard balls bouncing around in my head. And I get kind of quickly buried in this noise, like, my God, what are we going to do? How do you contemplate effectively seizing the contents of a museum? When we're the FBI, we're not really equipped to do it. We don't have our own museum. We don't have a collection storage space. We don't have an environmentally controlled warehouse to move these things to. And you certainly can't just seize them, throw them in a brown paper sack, and slap an evidence sticker on them. That's not what this is. So you could kind of imagine the next steps for me, right? Where this goes into just panic mode, kind of rapid fire team building, casting about, trying to find all the right experts to give us the guidance that we need. And so we spent some time, but I still needed some expertise. I need an expert to go back into his house and pinpoint specific objects to help us build our probable cause argument. So that was the next stage. And so, as you've seen in the book, I recruited Holly Cusack McVeigh, was a professor at the University of Indiana there in Indianapolis, a good friend and colleague of mine that did have the requisite expertise. She had spent a lot of her professional years working on Native American repatriations and had the qualifications to come in. And so we set up another ruse and another visit. We went out and visited. We spent some more time with Don. And just like the first time, he was more than happy to invite us in and was happy to chat. And I really didn't do a whole lot of the talking. I let Holly talk to him because, she spoke his language better than I did, just to talk about the artifacts. And he loved to tell his stories. And so he just gave us more and more and more derogatory information that implicated him in some of this illegal activity. And, would just outright tell us. He'd point to pieces and like, yeah, I dug this up on this reservation, or I dug this up here. Oftentimes, a couple of times he talked about digging some things up on private property very carefully. I had to, kind of worm in a question gently, like, well, whose property was that? Was that something you guys leased? Did you have, like, the basic I was trying to get at, did you have the property owner's permission to do that? And of course, he was honest and come back and say, well, no, we just know where to go. And of course, that's just evidence, right? Like, okay, you may not be violating ARPA, but you can't go onto somebody's property and dig up material and take it, right? That's just theft, right, at the state level. Anyway, this is all stuff that we're using to just build our probable cause arguments. And so that was that next stage, that second visit. And he really gave us some, pretty damaging evidence against himself.
In your book, you say that he kind of saw himself as a real life Indiana Jones, that for decades he had been, quote unquote, preserving history, but he was a grave robber.
I mean, I talked about this a minute ago, right? This kind of that mindset, that psyche that many of these folks have, that they're somehow kind of preserving these things, and maybe in some way that they are preserving them, but it never occurs to them. And I dropped this thread a few minutes ago. I wanted to talk on it, so I'm glad you've brought me back around to it. It never occurs to these folks that when you go up and dig up an indigenous grave site, a native site, perhaps they don't want you to take their things. These things were buried in the ground for a reason, right? These grave goods were buried spiritually for their loved ones to take with them into the spirit world. So it's not okay that you come and take them out of the ground and take them home. I don't care that you're trying to preserve them. That's not what they were intended. And that's that morality piece that seems to be missing a lot in the mindset of Don and like-minded folks. That it's not up to you to come along and dig these things up and just take them home.
I know I'm jumping ahead, but in speaking with him, you had an analogy that really kind of made him, for a moment at least, it smacked him in the face with the reality of what he was doing. Could you talk about that?
This is an important point, right? So we had a search warrant for Don's house, and a lot of people don't understand that. We did actually I wrote a really quite long, about almost 100-page long search warrant to get into Don's residence. Pretty good probable cause statements to the judge, federal judge. The only question the judge asked me, in fact, was, did he really do all this? It's like, yeah, Judge, he did it. The judge just looked at me, signed it, and said, good luck. I was pretty convinced we didn't need the search warrant. Don was friendly. He was affable. He just wanted to talk. And I don't think Don really saw himself as a criminal, right? I mean, there was a reason none of the human remains were out on display with the rest of the artifacts. There were signs there that indicated he knew that some of this stuff was problematic. And if he had all these human remains out in the main room on display, people might object and start asking uncomfortable, difficult questions. And so those things were hidden away behind locked doors. So I don't want to suggest that he had no knowledge. He had knowledge, but I don't think he really thought of himself as a criminal. He just thought of himself as kind of an archaeologist. He used to say he was an archaeologist. I'm like, well, pretty sure archaeologists don't dig up village sites with bulldozers. So you're not an archaeologist. He thought of himself that way. And so we start this operation with him, and we do get consent. That was the point I was trying to make, is I was pretty confident he would consent and just allow us to come in and do this. Talk to him, say, Don, you've done these things. You've been collecting these things improperly for decades. You know it's wrong. We know it's wrong. It's better for you. It's better for the government. It's better for the taxpayer if you just cooperate with us. Can we come in and seize all the problematic material that we see with your consent and your blessing, and we'll take it away, and we'll repatriate these things. We'll start working with the tribes. And he was happy to do that. And he consented. He had counsel. We worked through him and his legal counsel. And ultimately, that's what Don wanted to do. I think he knew he wasn't long on this earth. He was 91 years old and didn't have much time on the earth left. And I think he just wanted to kind of make things right. And, he did sign and gave his consent and waive for us to come in and seize this material. So we ultimately did not have to serve our warrant. But, as an agent, right, you're on consent. And so what's the most important thing when you're on a consent search, right? It's you want to keep consent, because as you know,
absolutely, which means a lot of times you have to kind of placate,
right? You gotta be nice, right? Because you don't want them to revoke consent, which we'll handle it if he does, but it just complicates things, right? And it's unnecessary. And so we tried to get Don and his wife to leave. We offered to take him to a hotel and do all these things and take care of his dog, and they didn't want to leave. They wanted to be there. So okay, we'll let you stay here and we'll work around him. But you can imagine we bring in this massive team. I mean, I had over 100 personnel on site at any given time. So it's this massive operation. It was quite disruptive. To make it easy for him, we've got folks walking his dog. We sent people out to get his prescriptions filled and go get him dinner, and we cooked and we cleaned the house for him. We did all of these things for him. So we're really the point of all of this diatribe is we're trying to just be nice, right? We want to be nice to Don, and we want to keep him cooperative and happy. And it's all fine. It's all working okay until we start actually seizing material. And so day one of our seizure operation, we are focused on the human remains. So number one priority is we're going to get all of these human remains out of here first and start to treat these people with some dignity that they've been robbed of for the last 60 years. And we get about, I don't know, sometime, maybe 2 or 3 in the afternoon. We'd been at it for a while, and Don's wandering around. He's there watching us do all of this. And he comes up to me that afternoon, and he's in a huff, and he's agitated. You can see that he's agitated. He stops me, and he's just like, I want to know what you're doing. I thought you were here to take my pots. He says something of that effect to me. And I just kind of looked at him. I was like, well, Don, we've discussed it. We talked to you and your attorney and your wife, and we've been through this. We're here to get all the problematic material. Well, he just was angry, and he's like, well, I understand why you want to take my pots. You can take all the pots. He's like, I don't understand. Why are you taking my Indians? And I just stopped. It's one of those rare moments you're like, I'm not really entirely sure how I'm supposed to respond to that, right? Like, that is so patently racist and offensive. Like, I'm not. So I just kind of turned and I looked at him, and I'm like, Don, I don't understand. He's like, well, I don't understand. Why are you taking all of my Indians? And that was the only time I really lost my cool. I didn't really super lose my cool with him. I was just annoyed with him. It was offensive. And I looked at him and said something to the effect of, well, Don, if that's the way you feel about it, then you don't mind if I go down to the road to the cemetery down there and I dig up your grandparents and I take them home, right? I'll take them home and stick them up on my mantle. You okay? Well, that pissed him off. And it was in that moment that I realized, right, this mindset that he had that, indigenous people had no moral equivalency to him. They weren't people. It's not the same as going down and digging up his white grandparents out of the cemetery. Well, you can't do that. That's horribly offensive to him. But it's okay to go out in the prairie in South Dakota and dig up these Indians. And that was this lesson that just smacked me right in the mouth as I was talking to him. This is just like the definition of racism. I'm not trying to fault him for it. I think Don was a product of his generation. All right. He came up he was born in the 20s. His granddaddy fought in the last of the Indian Wars, probably. And so he just had this culture behind him, this kind of really offensive view of the whole thing. But he got mad when I said that about digging up his grandparents, and he didn't have a response. He got really mad. He just turned around and walked away in a huff. And that was that. But I wrote about that a little bit because it was such a jarring and poignant moment for me, and one that I won't ever forget.
And even for me, as I'm reading the book, I was looking at him as somebody who was ignorant of the law. But when it got to that point of the book, that's when the hairs on my arm stood up and I had this chill and the anger just flooded me because I realized, oh my God, this guy has no respect at all for, the Indian culture, Native Americans, their cultural property, no respect whatsoever. And that's when my whole thought about who Don Miller was and what Don Miller had done really changed, and I was looking at him as a criminal.
Yeah, well, that's why the book is titled The Grave Robber, because at the end of the day, that's really what we're talking about, right? Don Miller was a grave robber, period. That's what he did. And he did it prolifically for 60 years all over the globe. You can tie a bow on it and try to put lipstick on it, but at the end of the day, Don was just a grave robber. I mean, if we had hours and I could share the photographs that we see, his photos, things that we see from him that he took, and just the macabre stuff that you would see in there, just horrible conditions and just the horrible. He would dig up graves and he would lay down in the graves with the bodies, and he was smiling and have his wife take pictures. He would go out with other folks and they would bring their kids, and I had photos of kids dangling their legs into these graves he was digging up, eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and everybody's smiling. They're all grinning like this is a day at the ballpark. And so it's just fascinating, right? He would oftentimes go to Haiti. He was very prolific in Haiti, would frequently go to Haiti and do missionary work. And so the community looks at Don and they're celebrating him as this pillar of the community. He does all this missionary work. He's a philanthropist. He does all this great stuff. And it never occurs to him, but he's going to Haiti to build churches, and then in the evenings and on the weekends he's plundering and looting their cultural heritage. Right? So it's just fascinating to look at psychology and how all of that works. And listen, I didn't work for the behavioral analysis unit. I'm not going to profile him, and I just find it fascinating. And in fact, we did talk to the behavioral analysis unit and wanted to have him profiled because he was we'll use the word fascinating. It's a terrible word, but unfortunately he passed before we were able to get any of that done. So I think they would have gotten a very unique profile from Don on that. But yeah, anyway, I mean, I don't want to start rambling about this, but it does challenge you to think about your concepts of racism and morality and how we view other cultures and other human beings. And, as I said, Don, if it was an indigenous culture, whether it was Native American or elsewhere, it didn't matter. He didn't view them as at the same status as a human being like him. They had no more moral equivalency to him than that rock did, or that mortar and pestle, or that pot. They were all kind of the same.
I did copy this statement that you said in your book that I just want to read it. You say, I saw this as a rare chance for the FBI to protect and preserve cultural heritage and offer some form of justice to the communities victimized by Don's looting. The case was an opportunity to turn a page in the FBI's relationship with tribal communities and to send a clear message that this kind of criminal behavior would not go unanswered.
Yeah, that was such an important thing to me personally. And I think for the organization professionally as we move through this thing, right? This was an unusual case for the FBI, as you know well, Jerry, because we didn't prosecute anybody. No one ever went to jail in this case. And you can imagine it lasted for a decade. We spent a fair amount of money. This was not an inexpensive investigation to conduct. Historically, traditionally, right, the FBI is a metrics-driven law enforcement organization. They want to see arrests and convictions and these types of things. And so a lot of times people would ask how I was successful at continuing this case for a decade in an organization that really isn't really designed to do that kind of stuff, where they want to see these deliverables. And I would say we had the right personalities in place at just the right time. It was kind of the perfect storm, if you will, to get folks that understood why this case was important. And this case was not about metrics. It wasn't about statistics, 515s that we want to get. Who cares, right? This case was about restoring dignity to these affected communities, right? That had their grandparents and their great grandparents ripped from the graves and stolen out of their crypts. And so thankfully, I mean, the FBI got behind me on this thing. I really thought at the beginning that the Bureau would be like, no way, we're not going to do this. Not if you can't arrest him. But, as you know, he was 91 years old. We're not going to subject him to the process. And I got criticized on that quite a bit. The tribal community, as a matter of fact, the Native community, I think, was really upset that we wouldn't charge Don. Now, as you know, the FBI doesn't make charging decisions. That wasn't my place, right? That's for the U.S. Attorney's Office to decide. But now that I'm retired and I say a little bit more publicly, that there's going to be very little will within the Department of Justice to charge a 91-year-old man for a nonviolent property crime. And the reality was, at 91 years old, at his frail physical state, he likely wouldn't have survived the process to arrest him or, initial appearance, put him in jail. Like, come on, that's not justice. So early on, that was the sense of justice. People wanted us to arrest him. We needed charges. And I would oftentimes talk to my friends and colleagues in the tribal community, just try to gently get them to understand, well, that's not really justice. That's more vengeance, right? That's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do here to deliver you justice in the best form that we can. It's imperfect. It never should have happened in the first place. You never should have been victimized this way, but you were. And this is the FBI doing what we can to make it right. And that's what this case was about. And I'm very proud of the FBI that for 10 years they stood behind this case and supported it, not only through personnel and just through just kind of support, but also financially, right? We cost quite a bit of money, as you might imagine. We had to store this material for a decade and do a lot of research. And so I'm very proud of the FBI for that, because this was doing the case for the right reasons.
Well, you have a whole book here. And before we started recording, I made the comment that, it's not a really good story unless something goes wrong. And so I do want to make sure people understand that part of the book is talking about the resistance. It did work out at the end, but you really did have to go through a lot of walls because the doors weren't open to you.
Oh, yeah.
to get this case done. And again, going back to that initial recovery of the items, it was one of the first times that the FBI had participated in a search that lasted 10 days. Talk about that.
Yeah, that was a really funny part of the story, because when we're doing that initial planning, and Jake Archer, I think, who you know from the Philadelphia office, was my co-case on this. And Jake is really the hero of this story. We couldn't have done this without Jake. I mean, just his background and expertise really complemented mine, and we were able to come in and build a really complex operation. If you read that in the book, what the funny part of that was, it was all on a cocktail napkin, right? I think we went to dinner one night, got steaks and a drink, and we're sitting there just talking about the plan and how we're going to do this and we're going to do that. We start scribbling stuff down on a cocktail napkin. And so the next day we transfer that to, like a PowerPoint, and we start actually mapping it out. But, I'm also proud to say that it worked. Like, our plan survived first contact, which is pretty unusual. And 10 years, 7,000 objects that we recovered, and we only had one minor loss, and that was at the very end after I gave it back to another organization, and a little lip off a pot broke off. It had already been glued on, and the glue broke and it came back off. And that's it. After 10 years, that's the only damage. So I'm really extraordinarily proud of my team and everybody that did this. But so, yeah, I want to answer your question about the length of the search. So as I go through this warrant, trying to plan on how long is this going to take. And as I said at the very beginning, it's tantamount to seizing the collection at a museum. And how do you do that? So they're asking, how long is it going to take? And truthfully, we said a month. We don't see any way to do this shorter than a month, to go in and do all the requisite care and handling and all the movement precautions that we have to take and all of these things. Well, nobody's going to do that, right? Nobody's going to let you do it for a month. So then we're trying to get it down. It's like, okay, bare bones, if we work round the clock and we've got multiple teams and we stack all these things, we can do it. Well, there was a lot of concern even with that, right? As you know, that's pretty unusual, right? That's asking an awful lot from any federal magistrate to give you the authority to go in and unseat somebody from their domicile, from their primary house for 10 days, right? Nigh unheard of, right? I think you might agree. But we're like, look, it's the only way. We're tasked with seizing the material, but equally important, we have to seize it in the right way. We can't harm the material. I used to tell people my nightmare, this is the dumb art crime guy stuff, right? Like what keeps an art crime guy up at night? Well, it's this. Imagine this 5,000-year-old pot sitting in Don's basement. It's been in his house for 50 years. But prior to that, it survived the looting process. Don went to Peru. He probed the ground with a rod. He finds a depression. He digs it up. So this pot's been in the ground for 5,000 years intact. It survives Don coming along, looting it. Then he throws it in the back of a station wagon and drives from Peru back to Indiana, because he did that a few times. He'd come across and drive up through the peninsula and all that. And then it sits in his house for all this time and it's intact. And then along comes the FBI and we drop it and break it. That's the dumb stuff that keeps us art crime people up at night, is we have to make sure that we do this right. So, we're contemplating this massive operation with no real sense that a federal judge is going to give us the authority to go in and displace somebody from their house on a warrant for 10 days. Again, they did. The judge understood where we were coming from. The U.S. Attorney's Office finally got on board with that concept that we would be there that long. But it couldn't be any longer than 10 days. And so we had to put this big round-the-clock operation together, which was quite impressive. And it was something to see, and not something I've seen since. We've tried to replicate it a few times, but that was the first, and it was quite impressive.
I do want to touch on the fact that, as in any search, one of the first things you want to do is to see what you have there and photograph it and catalog things, or at least write out some type of a plan before you actually start gathering things. And it was at that time that you really got an understanding of the casual and heartless way he had stored some of these human remains. So can we talk about that? Because I think that was a turning point for you too, where just looking at this stuff and the way it was stored.
That point is really a testament to what I talked about a minute ago. Just having somebody like Special Agent Jake Archer on the team and all of my other art crime team folks that were out there, having that expertise with me, right? And that we were able to shift on the fly, if you will, because our plan that we had spent, weeks and months developing, we started this case fall of 2013, but we didn't actually execute this search operation until April 1st of 14. So, we've got 6 months of building the case and about 3 solid months of plan development, like how are we going to do this? And so we had a pretty solid plan, and we had a triage process. We knew what material we were going to go after first and how we were going to photograph it all in situ, how we were going to document it, collect it, and then register it and move it, and all of these things that we have to do. And what we did not know, though, as I told you at the beginning, is we didn't know how many human remains were on site. We didn't anticipate what we found. We thought we might find a few and wouldn't be terribly disruptive, because you have to handle human remains completely different, right? These are human beings. It's not evidence. We're not just collecting evidence here, folks. We don't just snap a photo, grab that human skull and throw it in a bag and let's move on. Horribly offensive, right, to the tribal community, and not the right way. And so we did a lot of things differently about this case. So as you read, and as you know, is highly unusual, we actually brought tribal representatives on site with us during the operation. So we've got non-government folks in the middle of our search operation to guide us, because we were so concerned about making some spiritual mistakes that we didn't want to. These people, these ancestors had been wronged enough. We didn't want to exacerbate that, right? We're here to help. And so we had tribal representatives on site to speak to the ancestors, to feed them and offer them prayers and smudge and do all the things that we needed to do. And so that in and of itself was very unusual.
I will say in the book, you talk about not necessarily giving them the full picture, of the conditions that some of these remains were found. Let me read another thing that I copied down. Arrowheads hammered into skulls for dramatic effect, and baby skulls repurposed as apple bowls, and a static accumulation of bones, sometimes mixed with animal remains, were scattered around the compound. Can't get any worse than that, you thought, but it did.
Yeah, it did. I mean, we were overwhelmed with the volume of it. I mean, like I said earlier, you couldn't open a cabinet, a box, a tote bin, a closet. It didn't matter. Everything, everywhere we looked on this 10-acre property, human remains were there, and we're finding them in terrible conditions. And we opened up he had a bomb shelter below the old farmhouse, and we're down in this terrible, dank, nasty, moldy room, made Jake terribly sick, and terrible place to work. But under a shelf in this dark, wet corner is a hefty garbage bag. We go to pull that garbage bag out, and a raccoon comes flying out of the damn thing. But we opened the bag after it scared the snot out of everybody. Scared everybody. I'm surprised Jake and I didn't start shooting at it. But that bag was full of human heads, skulls. I mean, not to be clear about that, full of skulls. But that was shocking, even for FBI agents. People, spent their careers in law enforcement. You don't expect to find these things, and you can imagine how devastating it was for the entire team, right? Not just the FBI folks that were on scene, and it was hard on them. But imagine all of the academic and non-law enforcement folks that we had out supporting us. It was terribly difficult for them to find these human beings housed in these conditions, just haphazard with no thought whatsoever. That really, was impactful for us. But I want to go back to answer your question a minute ago about, was this a turning point? Because we didn't know about all of these remains. And so we had this grand plan, and we're going to collect all these artifacts in this way. We're going to do this and that. We knew that we were going to start with human remains, but we were only expecting to find a few, and then we'd move on. Well, we didn't find a few. We found thousands. So, we had to circle up. Jake and I sat down and we're like, oh, we got to change the whole plan. Like, we have to totally pivot here and go a different direction. And so we did. We made some changes on the fly, made our adjustments and put it into play. And it worked fine. It was all great. Everybody on the team just did a wonderful job. But, you touched on the mixture with the animal bones. That was a big problem because he had so many animal bones in this collection as well. And oftentimes these things were intermingled. And it's not easy to identify human bones versus animal bones. And so we had a forensic anthropologist on the team with us, another agent who in her prior life had been a forensic anthropologist, which is why we brought her to the site, because she had this very specific expertise. So she was able to go through and help us sort through, this is human, this is animal, et cetera, because we weren't interested in seizing animal bones. But it was just a devastating search site, right? And it's strange. You think about violent crimes that we work, and we've all been on some pretty horrific violent scenes, but there's something different and hard to explain about a case like this, where it wasn't a crime of violence. It wasn't something that was dynamic that just occurred. This was a willful, thought out, meticulously developed collection, and the neglect was intentional, right? Or at the very minimum was preventable. And so I don't know, somehow that just made it worse. And so there were a lot of tears on site, a lot of emotion from folks that were working on the site. And so we had to have grief counselors and some other things like that out in play. But yeah, it was a very disturbing search operation.
Now, one of the reasons you talk about this case taking 10 years, and one of the reasons it took 10 years is because, again, this is stolen cultural property. So the return of this cultural property is your responsibility. Now that the government has taken possession of this stuff, now we got to get it back to the people that it belongs to.
You'd be surprised at how many people in the FBI were like, okay, can we now give it away to some other agency? That's where you kind of run into the other half that doesn't really appreciate what we're doing. And they were looking for every way possible for us to abdicate our duty. But I stood by that and said no from day one. Like, this is now our responsibility. We took the case. We seized the material. There is no one else to do this job but us. And we just have to stay with it. And what was ironic about the thing is, I remember at the very beginning, I had to come to headquarters. I had to brief the 7th floor and get the executives on board to fund the case. And I was asked in that very, with the AD and maybe even the EAD, I don't remember who all was in there, but one of the questions that came out in that was, well, how long is this going to take? And that day at the very beginning, I said 10 years. And so, it was a bit prophetic at the time, because I told him it would take 10 years, and it took almost 10 years to the day to get it done. And, it was a large feat to research, culturally affiliate, and repatriate 5,000 cultural artifacts and 2,000 human bones. And we knew at the beginning that, look, nobody's going to get it all. There's a big misunderstanding. Miller's collection was actually 42,000 pieces. That was our final count. But we didn't seize that entire collection, right? We seized about 7,000 of those 42,000. And so people often say, well, why didn't you take it all? Well, understand, right? You know this well. The FBI is there to seize what is illegal, or what was problematic, might be in violation of treaties or some other things. Now, remember, Don consented and he allowed us to take what we wanted, but we weren't there to take the whole collection. I mean, some of it, we couldn't demonstrate was unlawful. Now, we told him that doesn't mean it's illegal. It just means we don't have enough information at the time to to show that it's illegal. And so therefore we left it. But even still, it was this massive job to repatriate thousands of these things, and it was very time consuming. And, COVID, of course, thwarted us just like it did the rest of the planet. That was an unexpected event that shut down a lot of the travel community. A lot of the reservations were locked down. A lot of our foreign partners that we were trying to engage with and move objects back to closed their borders, and we couldn't get in. And so, that kind of held us up a little bit. And then you've got just the natural rhythm of the FBI, right? You've got transfers and promotions and retirements and all of these things, and including my own. Eventually, I left headquarters, and, this case stayed with me. It didn't matter what role I had in the FBI. This case was always mine. Whether it was mine technically on paper or not, it was mine. And so I was responsible for it, and we would just move the ball forward. But I had such a great team. I mean, literally everybody on the art crime team has a thumbprint on this case. It's one of those rare cases where everybody touched it. Everybody is equally responsible for the success of this case. And I kind of got sidetracked there. I was going to say, we knew at the beginning, look, we're probably not going to get 100% of these things repatriated. We had always estimated 3 or 4% of the objects would be just very difficult to culturally affiliate. It's not that unusual, if you're dealing with old material and it's maybe difficult to understand what culture or what modern day country it belongs to. That's not always easy to do. And again, I think we were kind of prophetic. So we're down to about, I'm retired now, but the FBI only has about a dozen or so pieces left out of the Miller collection that have not been repatriated. So we're at about 96% or 97% success. Everything else has gone home. And those few things that remain, we've had experts all over the globe looking at it, and no one can really pin down precisely where they should go. And so that remains to be seen. I think the Bureau has got some work to do on that and some decisions to make on how they're going to handle that. But quite proud of them and the team and, the fact that we got it as far as we did.
Well, I do have just a few more questions before we wrap everything up. And I really would like to spend a little bit of time talking about your outreach to the Native American communities and their response to the FBI, first of all, investigating this case and then wanting to return the cultural property. How do you do that? There's so many Native American tribes in this country. How do you know who to talk to or who to give this stuff back to?
Good question. It was such a difficult part of this case, right? Because there are so many sovereign nations that are affected, right? So at the time, I don't have the numbers in front of me, Jerry. It was something like 576 federally recognized tribes at the time that we did the case. That number has risen some, and I think, and then in fact has dropped back down a little bit. But the number fluctuates a little bit from time to time. But those are federally recognized tribes. And then you've got twice that many that aren't federally recognized. It might be state recognized, but aren't federally. And so it's a very difficult task, right? How do you reach out to all of these sovereign nations to engage with them in consultation and just to inform them, right, that this has happened and this is what we have, and then let them know we need their help. We want them to come. So the way that I approached it from the beginning was like, look, I want you to guide me. And this is my message to the tribal community. This never should have happened to you. This is terrible. And I realize I'm non-native. I don't understand necessarily your culture and your spirituality and all your beliefs, and we don't want to make this worse, right? That was our goal. Let's just do this in a way that we don't make it worse. And the FBI has not always been very good at that, particularly with the tribal community, right? We've got a long history of difficult relationships with the tribes, and frankly, we just didn't get it right most of the time. We really screwed some things up along the way. And so we were bound and determined not to do that with this case. So that was the message at the beginning. Please help us. We want your guidance. We want your wisdom in allowing us to treat your ancestors and your cultural heritage in the right way. Again, this is about justice and doing it properly. And so I think that really spoke to the tribal community in a way that the Bureau had never been able to speak to them before, right? Because the Bureau had a tendency to just try to treat them as victims or treat them as suspects or whatever it was, and not as partners. And we approached it from partnership. We want partnership with you. We want you to come in and guide us. But as you said, it was difficult. We certainly don't know everybody to talk to. too. And so in some of these tribal communities, right, like in many modern governments, they have election cycles, and sometimes those election cycles are rapid. They might be annually. And so every year there might be a new election, there's a new government in play. And so it's just very difficult to always navigate that. But like with any good network, we just relied on a few trusted sources within the communities, people that we had really strong relationships with that could guide us through that map, right, would help us navigate these waters. And, these were tribal members themselves that were really just good, fantastic partners and would help me figure out who I needed to talk to and for this or this problem or that problem. And, I'd always say, like, how many nations are represented at the UN? I'm not sure what the actual number is, but let's say it's 150, whatever the number is. Have you ever seen 150 sovereign nations come together and agree on everything unilaterally? And the answer is no. And that, kind of translates to the tribal community as well. It wasn't always easy because there wasn't always agreement. But our position was, kind of the same throughout. It's like, we're here to respond to your needs, right? You tell us what you want the FBI to do, and that's what we will try to deliver to you. And so we always tried to put it back into the hands of the tribal community. Just, you all sort it out. We understand that there may not always be agreement. What we always sought to get in the tribal community was a consensus. And if we could get consensus, then we would go forward with that plan. And it worked out pretty well.
And I know that in the book you talk about that full process, but if you can kind of summarize the decision that was made as to who was going to take possession of the human remains, because as you said, you had probably the bones of about 500 individuals.
Yeah, so 2,000 bones that represented nearly 500 individuals, but not all of them Native American. And I think that's a really important distinction that we need to talk about, right? The majority of them we believed to be Native American, but you have to understand this process, all right? These are undocumented, right? They're not archaeological digs. We don't necessarily know the culture. We don't necessarily know what site he excavated these remains. And then he would bring them home and chunk them into boxes or tote bins, and there they would sit for a decade. And then he might intermingle some bones. You read some excerpts where he was doing some really horrible things, like hammering arrowheads in to make it look like, and he would tell, oh, this Indian was shot by another Indian with an arrow. Well, it's nonsense. It was just utter nonsense. This was manipulation that he did in order to create the environment and tell these stories. But he would also intermingle bones. Like if he had a human skull that maybe was missing a mandible, he would go root around in a box and pull a mandible out that might fit, and he would glue it on or screw it on. Well, that's complicated, right? It's very offensive and horrible to talk about, but it's complicated osteologically because that's not one person, right? That's two people. And then maybe sometimes he would take the teeth from another mandible or another jaw and insert them into that one. And so it might not even be two people. Sometimes it might be 3 or 4 people represented in one skull on his shelf. And so it got extraordinarily complex. And then he didn't really value the disarticulated remains, the ribs, the femurs, the, ulnas, and these types of things. Oftentimes those would just be chunked into boxes, but they would be intermixed. You'd open a box and there'd be 25 femurs in there. Well, who do those belong to, right? And trying to figure out how to do. So we had an osteological team work on this for a couple of years. God love them. What an impossible job to do. And one of the things that came up early on was, this concept of DNA testing. So right off the bat, we knew that wasn't going to work. And so, the tribes don't want DNA testing because it's offensive, right? In order to get the DNA samples, you have to core into the bones, which means you have to drill into the bones, which is just further insult and injury to their ancestors. No one wanted it, least of all me. I didn't want to do it. The tribes don't want to do that. It's just offensive. We also understood that it's not going to yield any real information, right? Because DNA only works when you have, the appropriate catalog, right? The appropriate library to reference it off of. And when you're dealing with historic remains that might be several hundred years old, right? That gets really difficult and is unlikely to produce any real results. And so we knew that we were going to be limited strictly to osteological exam, which is just taking measurements and weights and some of those kinds of things and running them through, a sociological database. And that database is not terribly robust. It's not a terribly great database. It just happens to be the best one they've got, the one they use. But it is not foolproof and oftentimes only gives you generalities. It might say, well, there's a 70% chance that this is Native American, but it's not going to identify which specific tribe. Sometimes it might, but generally speaking, it does not. So again, I don't want to chase this rabbit too far, but you understand what I'm saying. It's a very imperfect process. And at the end of the day, we were just left with more questions than answers. And so point of all of this is that we have to discern out of these 2,000 human bones that we recovered, how many of them are native. We know that some of them are foreign because we know that he was excavating remains in Mexico and Haiti and Papua New Guinea and Easter Island and a lot of these other locations. And so we're left with this difficult task of trying to sort out the foreign remains from the Native American remains. And then the domestic material that we've got, well, they're not always necessarily Native American. Some of them might be Caucasian. Some of them might have been Asian, because these are just historic burials that are spread across the U.S. And so he was just digging up bodies. So it was a really terribly difficult process, and one that was just not going to yield a lot of results. And so when we could culturally affiliate a set of remains, of course we did. And we would then work with that specific tribe to understand their wishes to how to rebury those ancestors. But we knew that that was going to be incomplete. And so at the end of the day, I don't remember, Jerry, what the actual number was. I don't have it in front of me, but there were a couple of hundred sets of remains that we just don't know where they belong. It's terrible. It's sad and just horrible, but it's just the truth. There was no more work to be done to culturally affiliate them. So now what do we do? And so that's where we had to rely on consensus from the tribal community. And what the tribal community told us at the time was, generally when they're faced with this kind of dilemma and you cannot specifically culturally affiliate, the remains, they would usually look to the closest federally recognized tribe to where the remains were recovered. And so in our instance, that would have been the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi, which, were the federally recognized tribe for Indiana. Lots of tribes, and I don't want to offend anybody in the tribal, many tribes have historical and migratory ties to Indiana. So this is where it really, you have to have that consensus amongst all of these potentially affected tribes. They have to kind of come together and have some agreement. And that agreement was that Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi would take possession of these unaffiliated remains and would do a reburial that was kind of, I don't want to use the term non-denominational. That's not really right. It's a bit nonsense. But use a reburial to do a reburial that was culturally neutral, right, that all of the tribes could accept. Because you have to understand, right, not every tribe has the same spiritual practices, right, or customary practices. They all kind of do it differently, and you just got to kind of find some middle ground there. And so, I was pleased with the final result. We feel like we did a pretty good job of getting everybody home to where they were supposed to go, but, we knew from the beginning it wouldn't be perfect.
The FBI had taken possession of these items, and you did it through consent. And I thought it was like a spiritual nod, the fact that 5 days after relinquishing all of this evidence and saying to the government, yes, you can have it all, Don Miller dies.
Yeah.
So my question is, what was your thought about that? And then what happened to the rest of the stuff that he had on his property that you did not take?
Yeah, good questions. The questions that I get from time to time on this. So yeah, I'll leave it to the reader to make their own determination about whether this was divine intervention on the timing of his death. It was impactful. It says a lot. So for the listener, Don consented to the search and the seizure, but that's not the end of it, right? There's a lot of work that has to take place. And ordinarily, we would put this type of seized material through forfeiture, as you know well, Jerry. But you also know that that's an extraordinarily time-consuming and difficult process, would require us to do probable cost statements on every individual piece and this and that. We just wanted to avoid all of that. So what we had told Don and his legal counsel and his lawyers that, hey, look, it makes the most sense for Don, his family, for the government, for him just to waive title. And then we could demonstrate, we'd do a wait period, our 30-day wait period. We would do that, and just to make sure that there weren't any counterclaimants. Now, we were pretty confident there wouldn't be no counterclaimants because these things are looted. They're stolen. No one else can claim actual title to them because they're stolen. But we did require that of Don, working through his lawyers, that he would waive any title claim that he would profess to have. So he agreed that he didn't own title to these things. And therefore, once that wait period, estoppel period was what I was trying to come up with. Once the estoppel period expired, effectively title would just transfer to the United States. Now, I'm grossly oversimplifying that for any of the lawyers listening, but this is generally what we did with this global agreement with him and his counsel. He signed over that collection to us, which helped us avoid the forfeiture process and all that. And that allowed us to move just a lot faster with his consent. But that took some time, right? He was happy to, I would say happy, but he consented to us seizing the material. But then it took about a year, not quite, but almost a year for us just going back and forth through negotiations with the Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney's Office, his counsel, his family, this and that. You get it. There was a lot of just back and forth on language. And then he just took some time. I think it took him some months just to even decide to do it. We were patiently waiting on him to execute that document. And then he finally did execute the document and then immediately passed away. And so you might discern from that he held on to life just long enough to make it right, or you might discern from that once he signed away his life's work and his prized possessions, he had nothing else to live for. I'll leave it up to the reader or the listener to make that determination. I'm not going to weigh in on that, but it was just profound, right? The timing of it.
One other thing I wanted to be clear. We talked about the return of the human remains, but you also returned the cultural properties, the bowls and the pots and the things that he had taken from all around the world. And you did that with those individual countries where he had looted the material.
We did. On the surface, those tended to be a little bit easier because we generally can kind of know specifically which country, would be the modern day equivalent. That does get complicated. Let's put it this way. If you're talking about some Aztec figurine or some Aztec pottery, well, right, we're talking about a culture that lived, eons ago, right? 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, whatever your culture might be. Well, their borders were starkly different than modern day borders. And sometimes that can get complicated, right? You might have a piece of pottery belong to a specific culture, South American culture, but modern day maps would say, Ecuador or Peru. Well, how do you determine where in the culture it was at geographically to know which country it goes back to? So sometimes it can get, and I'm not really explaining that well, but you understand it can be complicated sometimes with modern borders. But, generally speaking, those are relatively easy to sort through and navigate. So the foreign material moved a little bit faster because it was just easier to identify them and engage state to state, nation to nation with them and get those processes going. It was a little more difficult with the tribal material because the migratory nature of, historical migratory nature of the tribes and the displacement of the tribes, right, from the U.S. government, all of these things that kind of compound that and make it just a lot more difficult. But so we had to engage, with quite several dozen foreign countries to return material. And some of them were just, onesie twosie things. We might have one object, and some were large, like, the Haiti returned quite large, almost 500 pieces, if my memory's right. And we effectively tripled the size of the Haiti National Collection in doing so, which was just a really proud, impactful moment for me. The Chinese repatriation was also quite large, with several hundred pieces, almost 400 pieces back to China. And you can imagine that was a little difficult, right? I mean, political relationships with China are difficult at times. And so there were some challenges that I wrote about in the book. I probably don't have enough time to get into all that, but you can read all about it. Kind of the pressure they put on us about returning that property to China. And of course, our position was, well, it's stolen property that rightly belongs to a sovereign nation. So, the FBI has a job to do, and that is return stolen property. So we did. But it wasn't always easy.
I think that's probably the understatement. That kind of sums up the book. What happened to all of Don Miller's property that the FBI did not take? What happened to that after his death?
Yeah, so another question we get frequently from folks, and it's a great question, and people have the right to understand what did happen. So as I said, we seized about 7,000 total objects out of the 42,000 that we counted in the collection. But remember, we're there to seize illegal or problematic pieces, right? We're not there to seize material that's lawfully owned, right? This is a prior FBI agent. It's not what we do. And so our process, and we had a whole team of experts, not only just FBI art crime team agents, but we also had archaeologists and anthropologists on site with us. And so we brought a team of experts in. And then we were also kind of like phone a friend, if you will. We also had a whole team of experts on the phone with us the whole time that we had access to as we were encountering material in the collection and trying to understand rapidly what the legal status may be. But it's really difficult to do because the collection was so eclectic and spans so many different cultures. I mean, it wasn't even just like Native American cultural goods or Maori stuff from New Zealand or whatever it might be. He had World War II memorabilia, lots of Civil War stuff, and we really weren't super interested in those things. Most of that stuff tends to be legal. Sometimes it's illegal, but it's really hard to tell. So we're on a clock, right? This. We talked about it. We're on a clock. Not only do we have just limited time that the judge is going to allow us to be there, but we also had a severe weather front moving in, and we just had to get out. So we had to make some hard decisions on site about what do we take, what don't we take. And we really just were focused on those things that were on the face apparently problematic or illegal. So everything else we had to leave. And, so we sat Don and his wife down with his lawyer, and we had some conversations with them about, don't misunderstand, right? The fact that we did not take it doesn't mean it's legal. There were plenty of material in the collection that were questionable, that we had a lot of questions about. We just didn't have enough information at the time, to develop probable cause for seizure. So we didn't. And so we basically put him and his family on notice that, look, just because we didn't take it doesn't make it legal. Everything in this collection has cloudy title problems, right? You don't own title to it because it's all been looted. And sometimes Don bought material, right? I was clear about that. He didn't dig everything. He bought stuff. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't looted. It just means he didn't loot it. And so we just put them on notice about the questionable legality, the problematic title for much of this collection. And we warned them not to traffic in it. Like, you really can't sell any of this stuff or traffic in it, knowing that it's got a questionable title problem. Because if something does in fact come up, we established that it was looted or stolen and you've sold it, you're now on notice, and therefore, you're going to be criminally culpable for it. So that was the stance that we took with it. And we just kind of put them on notice that you really can't do anything with it. You just need to hang on to it. Shockingly, not long after we concluded that search, one of the local area museums hosted a temporary exhibition of Don's collection, despite the FBI coming in and raiding Don.
Wow.
And seizing it. And you're just looking at these people. I paid them a visit. It's just like, what are you thinking? Like, what are you guys doing?
It was almost as if they were still celebrating his collection.
Well, it was that. It was maybe they were kind of giving us the finger a little bit, perhaps. But I chatted with them. I was like, you guys are purported to be a reputable institution. You now know that this collection is extraordinarily problematic. I don't know that any reputable museum should host an exhibition of this stuff. But that didn't deter them, and they sure did. And then he was awarded a posthumous award and all these other. It's crazy, right? What people think about that, like they just didn't trust us. I understood it, at the time, because how we do these cases. At the time, it was a lot of no comment. We didn't have a lot to say to the press at the time. And so when there's a vacuum, people are going to fill it, right? And they usually fill it with nonsense. And in defense of the public who felt strongly about what the Bureau was doing, they didn't know what we knew, right? Nobody in the public knew that he had the remains of babies, kids, and all of this stuff piled into boxes. And nobody knew that. They just thought he had, this collection of artifacts. And so I hope the purpose of this book is to shed some light on why we did what we did and why it's wrong. I'm hoping this book challenges folks and starts that conversation maybe to rethink how they view the ethics and the morality of some of this behavior.
After he died, do you know what happened to the property?
To the collection? No, we don't really know. There was some indication a few years back that a little bit of the collection had gone up for auction somewhere. But no, Jerry, quite frankly, we just don't have the manpower to chase all that down all the time, right? When you're, as busy as we were and inundated with leads, you just pick and choose your battles.
Well, I know the FBI has a wonderful article on the website that talks about this particular case and has some videos and some photos. I will put some photos in the show notes for this episode, but the main thing I'm going to do is to link two news articles and this FBI website article about the case. And again, your book is called The Grave Robber, and it is a very interesting read. It allows you to learn not just about the art crime team and how they handle a case like this, but it actually is a pretty book to learn about the behind the scenes operation of the FBI and how negotiations with the U.S. Attorney's Office and a field office with headquarters, all of that comes into play, and I think is a pretty interesting read. So thank you so much, first of all, for writing the book, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, but also thank you for coming on the show and giving us a look into the book and the different chapters that you've written. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jerry. I'm thrilled to do it. Happy to come on.
All right. So now we're at the part of the episode where I ask my standard question, when and why you joined the FBI.
Yeah, so we did talk about this a little bit, right? My career trajectory was military, right? As trained as a bomb technician, bomb disposal technician, and then that just naturally led to a progression in law enforcement. Which, again, I don't know that I didn't grow up dreaming to be an FBI agent or a police officer, right? It just was a natural progression for me. Well, you're a bomb technician, now what? Well, there's really only one place for me to go with those skills, and that's to a bomb squad on a police department. So that's what I did, and then doing that work as a bomb technician for years. As a local police officer, I still had a lot of experience working with the FBI and other federal agencies, ATF. And what you may not know is the Secret Service, unlike the FBI, which does have special agents trained as bomb technicians, the Secret Service does not do that, right? So they instead rely on the military to supply that expertise. And so for 12 years of my military service, I also worked frequently with the Secret Service, as do most military EOD technicians. And so the best way to put that into perspective for you would be kind of like a TFO, if you will.
Another acronym, just in case.
Task force officers, TFO task force officers. So you get creds. You're not a Secret Service employee. You just, you're on loan to them from the military, and your function is to go around with them in their protective mission, right? If they're protecting the president or their vice president or dignitaries or whatever, and you're there to do bomb sweeps for all intents and purposes. You're there to locate those devices before there's an issue and then get the local or state bomb squads involved to neutralize those devices. So anyway, the point being that I had spent years working with federal agencies and had a lot of friends and colleagues. Even before 9/11, I was under some pressure. I had a lot of friends pressuring me like, well, you've got a degree, you've got this law enforcement background, you're a bomb guy, you should just come into the FBI or just come into the Secret Service. And I had a lot of folks pressure me for the Secret Service, but it just wasn't for me. I didn't want to do the protective stuff. I'd seen enough of that. And, I kind of just applied to the FBI, I would say on a whim, but I think I was like most agents. I didn't expect the FBI to actually call me back. But they did. I managed to get through each phase, and they kept writing me letters and they kept calling me. I was like, oh, this is going to work out. And so, the FBI does finally offer me a position. It was funny because one of my closest friends in the world, we came up in the military together. We were both bomb techs, and then we were both police officers together. And we just kind of stayed. And I was pretty happy in my police life. I had a great career going on doing bomb tech and special operations stuff, doing those things. I was having a lot of fun. And then I've got this offer from the FBI, and he's like, oh, you're not going to like it. It's a very different type of organization. But my answer to him at the time was, yeah, but how do you not? Right? Like, how many people get offered a position as a special agent with the FBI? Not many, right? And I was like, I'm not going to be the guy that says no thanks. Like, you wouldn't be able to live with yourself. Yeah. I was like, I'd regret that for the rest of my life. So of course I'm going to go do it. And if I don't like it, then I'll come back. But I did like it. I mean, I didn't like everything about it. I don't think anybody ever does. But my career has treated me quite well. Very thankful to the Bureau and the opportunities they gave me, and the places I've gone, and that I've seen, the people I've met, has just been extraordinary. But that's it. I mean, Jerry, that's how I landed in the FBI. I think probably like most of us and like most of my life, I feel like I kind of just stumbled my way into it.
And how long were you in?
So 20 years. I did a 20-year career.
And of that time, how many years were you a member or working art crime cases?
Almost all of it. I came onto the art crime team. Officially, I came onto the team in 2008. So I think I was dabbling in those cases in 2007, as soon as I transferred to Miami. So I entered service in the FBI in February of 2004, and then was transferred to Miami in 2007. I don't remember exactly. Sometime towards the end of that year, I started just kind of dabbling in the art stuff and just figuring out that we were working those cases. And then I made it onto the team in 2008.
We won't go into detail now, but you eventually became a manager of the program at FBI headquarters. And so not only did you have all of this investigative experience, but now you have all of this administrative and managerial experience. You retired. What are you doing now? I hope you're still using all of that experience.
Like many federal agents, I was ready to retire. I mean, I had done 33 years of government service, right, between military, police, and FBI. And let's be honest, I felt like I had to earn the right to retire from government life. Like most of us old children, I wasn't ready to stop doing what I love. I mean, I love the art crime stuff. I'm very passionate about it. I love my teammates. I mean, they were family. So it's not surprising then, I think, that I wasn't ready to hang up the stirrups. So I retired from the FBI and I started a company, and I brought along some really talented, really great folks from the FBI's art crime team, from the Department of Justice, State Department, Homeland Security, My goal with this company, which is called Argus Culture Property Solutions, was really simple if you think about it, right? I would often reflect on the FBI art crime team's success, like what made us successful as a team. And so we had our own organic expertise, and that's fine. We did have that. We had some really talented agents on our team and some really talented professional support folks. But what really made us successful was all of our collaborative partnerships. It was these relationships we had with our other federal agencies, our other law enforcement, foreign partners, academia, the museum world, you get it. And so when I started this company, it was like, well, this isn't rocket science. I'm just going to rebuild this model. Like, let's bring all of those disparate skill sets to one bench and put them all into one place. So that's what I've been doing for the last 2 years is building out this company, and couldn't be more pleased with the team we've got. And, I usually joke and say, well, I'm just making the wayward home for art crime, art crime agents when they retire. But we'll see. We're really excited. We've got some great work going on with the company. And I'm just, I'm happy that I can continue to be of some help in the cultural heritage space.
All right. And I had mentioned that I had done an episode with Jeff Kelly, episode 341, and he is part of your staff.
Jeff is fantastic. I mean, he's one of the good ones. Let's face it, they're all good ones. But Jeff, look, I mean, from interviewing him, was a very long time, very seasoned and experienced FBI agent, not just on the art crime front, but across all of his career and working a host of criminal issues. And so, yeah, why wouldn't I bring his expertise on? And, and Jeff and I aren't just friends. As I said, I consider the art crime team kind of, as family. So happy to have Jeff along with all of our other partners in the company.
At the end of every episode, I like to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
My last word is what it always is when I talk about the Don Miller case. I want to be very careful to say that this wasn't the Tim Carpenter show. My name might be on the book, but I just want to be clear to everyone that's listening. This was a team effort, right? This took a village. It took everybody, not just within the FBI. It took the support of all of our friends in academia, the tribal community, our foreign partners. It took everyone, the media, everybody had a hand in this case, and it took all of them to make sure that justice was served for these affected victim communities. And I just want to make sure that I say that I sometimes get the credit for it, but it was really because of the great team that we had.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a direct link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of retired agent Tim Carpenter, as well as lots of case-related images and links to articles about Don Miller's illicit collection of stolen cultural artifacts and human burial remains. There's also a link to The Grave Robber, that recounts the FBI's investigation of Don Miller. There's also a link to FBI Case File Review episodes 341 with art crime team member Jeff Kelly and episode 22 with Bob Bazin, one of the original art crime agents. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.